Imagine trying to build roads, railways, and ports across 150 countries at the same time. Now imagine you're doing all of this while spending over $1 trillion. That's exactly what China attempted with the Belt and Road Initiative, the largest infrastructure experiment in human history. And then, quietly, they changed course. Not because the engineering failed, but because something more complicated happened. In 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping stood in Kazakhstan and announced something unprecedented. China would fund and build infrastructure across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Roads connecting landlocked countries to ports, railways cutting through mountain ranges, power plants bring electricity to regions that had been dark for generations. They called it the Belt and Road Initiative. Over 150 countries signed agreements. Estimates of what China would spend varied wildly from $1 trillion to over $4 trillion over the life of the project. Even the conservative estimates made it the largest infrastructure investment in modern history. To put that in perspective, the United States spent about $13 billion on the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $170 billion today. China was planning to spend 6 to 20 times that amount, across 3 continents, simultaneously. The motivation seemed clear on the surface. China had massive foreign currency reserves, over $3 trillion sitting in central bank accounts. They had construction companies that had built entire cities inside China and needed new projects. They had steel mills, cement factories, and equipment manufacturers operating below capacity. After decades of rapid growth inside China, these industries faced a problem. Demand was slowing domestically, cities had been built, high-speed rail networks were complete. The construction boom that had transformed China was running out of domestic projects. But the deeper strategy was more interesting. China imports most of its energy through a few narrow shipping lanes. 80% of their oil passes through the Strait of Malacca, a waterway so narrow that any hostile navy could shut down China's economy in days. This geographic vulnerability haunted Chinese strategic planners. If a conflict ever erupted, say, over Taiwan, China's energy supplies could be cut off almost immediately. The country would run out of oil in weeks. Building roads and railways across Central Asia meant creating alternative routes. Funding ports in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and East Africa meant securing backup access to resources. Developing overland pipelines meant reducing dependence on vulnerable sea lanes. This went beyond business. The objective focused on securing China's economic lifelines through physical infrastructure under its influence. For the countries receiving these investments, the pitch was convincing. Most developing nations struggle to get infrastructure loans from Western institutions. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund attach conditions: reform your governance, reduce corruption, meet environmental standards, restructure your economy. These conditions make sense from a lender's perspective, but they also mean projects take years to approve and often never happen at all. A government in Africa or Asia could spend 5 years negotiating with the World Bank, submitting environmental impact studies, reforming regulations, only to have the project rejected or delayed indefinitely. China offered something different: fast decisions, fewer conditions, and willingness to fund projects that Western lenders considered too risky. A country could sign an agreement with China and see construction crews arriving within months. Railways that governments had discussed for decades suddenly became real. In Kenya, China funded a railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, a project Kenyan leaders had wanted since independence in 1963. In Pakistan, they committed to a $62 billion economic corridor connecting Chinese western provinces to the Arabian Sea. In Ethiopia, they built an electric railway to Djibouti, giving a landlocked country access to a port for the first time in modern history. For politicians in these countries, Chinese financing solved an immediate problem. They could deliver visible infrastructure projects to voters within their term in office. Not promises of future development, actual roads, railways, and ports. The ambition was breathtaking, and for the first few years, it seemed to be working. By 2018, something unexpected started happening. Countries that had enthusiastically signed up for Chinese-funded infrastructure were running into problems. Most Belt and Road projects were funded through loans, not grants. Countries borrowed money from Chinese banks to pay Chinese construction companies to build infrastructure. The assumption was that once completed, these projects would generate enough economic activity to pay back the loans. But that assumption hit reality hard. Sri Lanka borrowed over $1 billion to build a port in Hambantota. The business case said the port would handle shipping traffic between Asia and Africa. The location seemed strategic, positioned along major shipping routes. But when it opened, almost no ships came. The port sat mostly empty. Shipping companies didn't reroute their vessels to an unproven port in a small country. when established ports in Singapore and Dubai already served their needs efficiently. Sri Lanka couldn't make the loan payments, the debt mounted, interest accumulated. In 2017, unable to service the debt, Sri Lanka handed operational control of the port to China for 99 years. The imagery was powerful, a country giving up sovereignty over strategic infrastructure because of unpayable debt. The term debt trap diplomacy entered global vocabulary. Western media ran stories warning other countries about the dangers of Chinese lending. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere. Pakistan's debt to China climbed past $25 billion. Malaysia suspended several major projects, saying the terms were unfavorable and previous leaders had agreed to inflated costs. African nations started warning each other about debt sustainability. The issue ran deeper than deliberate debt traps, a simplified narrative that misses what actually happened. The real issues were more fundamental. First, many of these projects were planned in countries with weak governance and political instability. A government would sign an agreement, then lose an election. The new government would want to renegotiate or cancel the project entirely. In Malaysia, the new government that came to power in 2018 immediately suspended Chinese projects worth over $20 billion. They claimed the previous administration had agreed to inflated costs and corrupt terms. Whether true or not, it showed how political transitions could derail projects midstream. Second, the economic projections were often overly optimistic. Building a port doesn't automatically create shipping traffic. Constructing a railway doesn't guarantee cargo. These projects needed broader economic development that wasn't happening fast enough. A railway is only valuable if there's cargo to move and passengers to transport. A port only generates revenue if ships use it. The infrastructure alone couldn't create the economic activity needed to justify its cost. Third, local resistance was stronger than expected. In Malaysia, citizens protested Chinese-funded projects as corruption-linked deals from the previous government. In Kazakhstan, there were demonstrations against Chinese land leases. In Myanmar, a major port project faced environmental protests and concerns about Chinese military use. China had excelled at building infrastructure inside China, where the government-controlled land acquisition could relocate populations and suppressed opposition. If a high-speed rail line needed to cut through a neighborhood, residents were compensated and moved. No protests were allowed. Construction proceeded on schedule, but across borders, in countries with different political systems, that same approach hit walls. Here's the deeper issue many analysts missed. Infrastructure succeeds only with stable governance, clear property rights, reliable legal systems, and political continuity, exactly what many Belt and Road countries lacked. China attempted something unprecedented, building long-term, complex infrastructure across dozens of countries with fragile institutions. In practice, that meant railways crossing borders with different laws, shifting governments, funding crises, and unresolved social tensions. Agreements got reopened, timelines slipped, coordination collapsed. This explains why even well-intentioned projects struggled. Engineering quality stayed high, Chinese firms delivered competently, financing existed. The weak link was governance capable of sustaining projects across multiple countries over time. And the problem continued after construction. Infrastructure needs maintenance, operations, safety enforcement, and revenue collection. Where governance failed, railways deteriorated, stations became unsafe, and costs exceeded returns, turning assets into liabilities. There's another layer to this. Many Belt and Road projects weren't standalone infrastructure. They were meant to connect countries into integrated networks. A railway from China through Central Asia to Europe only works if all the countries along the route maintain their sections, use compatible systems, and allow smooth border crossings. But coordinating this across multiple countries proved nearly impossible. Different gauge railway tracks, different electrical systems, different customs procedures, different political priorities. Kazakhstan might maintain its railway section well, but if Uzbekistan lets theirs deteriorate, the whole route becomes unreliable. If Turkmenistan changes its border crossing policies, cargo gets delayed for days. China discovered that building transnational infrastructure requires not just construction, but ongoing diplomatic coordination that's extraordinarily difficult to maintain. By 2019, the political environment had shifted dramatically. In the United States and Europe, concerns about Chinese influence through infrastructure investment became a major foreign policy issue. The narrative emerged that China was using debt to trap countries and gain control over strategic assets. Whether or not that narrative fully captured reality, it had real effects. Countries became more cautious about signing new agreements. Political opposition parties campaigned against Belt and Road projects. Media coverage turned skeptical. India, worried about Chinese encirclement, opposed the initiative entirely. Japan launched its own infrastructure funding programs to compete. the United States announced programs to counter Chinese influence. China found itself in an unexpected position, defending projects that were supposed to demonstrate generosity and partnership, but were increasingly portrayed as predatory lending. The irony was that many of these projects were genuinely needed. Developing countries desperately require infrastructure investment, but the combination of debt stress, political instability, and geopolitical rivalry created an environment where even successful projects became controversial. A dam that brought electricity to rural areas would be criticized as a debt trap. A railway that reduced transport costs would be portrayed as Chinese control over strategic infrastructure. The geopolitical context transformed how these projects were perceived, regardless of their actual economic impact. In 2021, something interesting happened. China didn't announce the end of the Belt and Road Initiative. President Xi still referenced it in speeches. Official statements continued to emphasize China's commitment to global development, but the actual flow of money told a different story. New international lending dropped sharply. According to data from Boston University and Aid Data, Chinese policy banks reduced overseas lending by roughly 90% between 2016 and 2022. That's not a gradual decline, that's a strategic shift. But something else took its place. China moved away from massive railways and ports scattered across dozens of countries and towards smaller, more targeted projects. The focus shifted from heavy physical infrastructure in unstable regions to digital networks and energy projects built with more stable partners. This marked a strategic change in direction. 3 areas became the new priorities. First, digital infrastructure. China started exporting surveillance technology, 5G networks, and smart city systems. These projects required less upfront capital than railways, created ongoing relationships through technology dependence, and faced less political resistance. Companies like Huawei, which had been blacklisted by the United States for security concerns, found new markets across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Countries that couldn't afford or access Western technology turned to Chinese alternatives. Digital infrastructure had advantages over physical infrastructure. It was cheaper to deploy. It created ongoing relationships through technical support and upgrades. And it was harder for opposition parties to campaign against a surveillance system doesn't create visible debt the way a port does. Second, energy and resources. Rather than funding general infrastructure everywhere, China focused on projects directly tied to resource security. Lithium mines in South America, copper in Africa, natural gas pipelines from Russia. These projects had clearer economic logic and directly served Chinese industrial needs. The return on investment was more predictable than speculative ports or railways. China's economy was transitioning toward electric vehicles and renewable energy. This required securing supplies of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals. Rather than building railways in unstable countries, China could invest directly in mines and energy projects that fed their industrial base. Third, regional partnerships. Instead of trying to coordinate projects across 150 countries, China deepened relationships with a smaller number of key partners. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, signed in 2020, created an integrated trade zone across Asia-Pacific. This was coordination through trade agreements rather than bilateral infrastructure deals. RCEP brought together China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and AHC-AHN countries into the world's largest trading bloc. This approach achieved some of the same goals as Belt and Road: deeper economic integration without the risks of infrastructure lending. China also had to deal with the legacy problem: countries that had borrowed money and couldn't pay it back. Unlike Western institutions, China didn't have a transparent process for debt restructuring. There was no Chinese equivalent of the Paris Club, where creditor nations coordinate debt relief. This created confusion and resentment. Countries in debt to China often didn't know who to negotiate with. Was it the Chinese government, Chinese banks, or Chinese companies? The opacity made things worse. When a country owed money to the World Bank, there was a clear process for renegotiation. When they owed money to China, it was unclear who even held the debt. Slowly, China began restructuring some debts. They extended repayment periods, reduced interest rates, and in some cases, converted loans to grants. But this happened case by case, without clear principles or transparency. The lack of a systematic approach meant each country had to negotiate separately, creating uncertainty and frustration. Zambia, for instance, spent years trying to restructure its Chinese debt, while the country's economy struggled. The delays worsened the crisis. When restructuring finally happened, it came too late to prevent serious economic damage. The strategy change reveals something important about infrastructure investment at scale. Building physical infrastructure across unstable political systems is extraordinarily difficult. It requires not just engineering and financing, but stable governance, property rights, political continuity, and local buy-in. China discovered what Western development institutions had learned decades earlier. You can't just build infrastructure and expect development to follow. The governance framework has to support it. The World Bank's conditions, governance reforms, anti-corruption measures, environmental standards weren't arbitrary obstacles. They were attempts to ensure the countries receiving infrastructure could actually maintain and operate it. China tried removing those conditions to speed up projects. What they learned was that the conditions existed for a reason. The difference is that China learned this lesson while attempting the largest infrastructure experiment in history, spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the process. The Belt and Road Initiative's evolution teaches us something fundamental about building infrastructure at scale. It's not primarily an engineering challenge, it's a governance challenge. You can have the best construction companies, unlimited financing, and ambitious plans. But if the countries you're building in have weak institutions, political instability, or lack the capacity to maintain and operate the infrastructure, the projects will struggle. This explains why infrastructure investment often fails to deliver expected results. It's not because the roads or railways are poorly built. It's because the ecosystem around them, governance, regulation, economic policy, political stability, isn't strong enough to make them work. A port needs customs officials who aren't corrupt. A railway needs safety inspectors who do their jobs. A power plant needs a regulatory framework that ensures payment for electricity. Without these institutional foundations, infrastructure becomes a liability. Beautiful new railways fall into disrepair. Modern ports sit empty. Power plants operate at a fraction of capacity. Here's the uncomfortable reality. No single country or institution has figured out how to build infrastructure at scale across the developing world. The World Bank and IMF attach conditions that make projects slow and difficult to implement. Years of planning, environmental studies, governance reforms. By the time a project is approved, political conditions may have changed entirely. China tried removing those conditions and discovered why they existed in the first place. Fast approval meant funding projects in unstable environments. Fewer conditions meant less assurance that countries could sustain the infrastructure. Private investors won't fund projects without strong institutions and clear returns. They need legal protections, enforceable contracts, and stable political environments. Precisely what most developing countries lack. This challenge extends far beyond China. It sits at the core of global development. Developing countries need trillions of dollars in infrastructure investment. Roads, ports, power plants, water systems, internet connectivity. These are essential for economic growth. But providing that infrastructure requires solving political, institutional, and financial problems that no one has successfully addressed at scale. The Asian Development Bank estimates that developing Asia alone needs $1.7 trillion in infrastructure investment annually through 2030. Africa needs hundreds of billions more. Latin America faces similar shortfalls. This infrastructure gap holds back economic development across most of the world. Without reliable electricity, businesses can't operate efficiently. Without good roads, agricultural products rot before reaching markets. Without ports, countries can't participate in global trade. But building this infrastructure faces obstacles that go beyond money. Even when financing is available, projects fail because of weak governance, corruption, political instability, or lack of local capacity to maintain infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative represented one attempt to solve this problem. It failed to deliver on its full ambition, not because of a lack of Chinese commitment or resources, but because the underlying challenge is genuinely difficult. So who can do this? The honest answer is, we don't know yet. China's approach showed that aggressive, state-directed investment can build physical infrastructure quickly, but it also showed the limits of that approach when governance and institutions are weak. Western approaches emphasize governance reforms and institutional development, but they're slow, often paternalistic, and frequently don't result in infrastructure actually being built. There's a gap between what developing countries need and what any existing system can deliver effectively. Some argue for blended approaches combining Chinese speed with Western governance standards, but this hasn't been successfully implemented at scale. Others suggest multilateral institutions should play a bigger role, but these institutions face their own constraints: slow decision-making, political disagreements among member countries, limited funding. Private capital could theoretically fill the gap, but private investors need returns that many infrastructure projects in poor countries can't provide. What's emerging is more complex than any single model. China has shifted towards selective, strategic partnerships focused on clear economic returns. Western institutions are responding with new initiatives and financing promises, but political limits and governance requirements slow their reach. Regional development banks now play a larger role, offering credibility and shared standards. No single approach closes the global infrastructure gap. Different models will coexist and compete. The real constraint remains unchanged. Infrastructure succeeds only where governance can sustain it. The debate goes beyond China versus the West. It centers on whether infrastructure can work in countries with weak institutions and how. The Belt and Road became a real-world stress test for global infrastructure. It showed where engineering succeeds and where governance breaks everything. China adapted, shifted strategy, and moved forward with harder lessons learned. The demand for infrastructure remains massive. The governance problem remains unsolved. And that leaves one question hanging over the next decade of development. Who do you think can actually solve this, China, the West, or no one at all? Let us know what you think in the comment sections. If this strategy surprised you, wait until you see how China solved a problem most engineers called impossible. Watch next. China just built 157 kilometers of highway without humans,